I'm going to start today's Q&A. We're going to be discussing a 13-year-old girl. Mom wrote in to me late last year, so it's been a while since I've been able to get to her summary. But at this point, she just finished 7th grade, and she came out to her parents as trans at the beginning of 7th grade. So daughter reports that she's felt like a boy for several years. 2.5 years ago, she was drawing a graphic novel about her baby sister, and she drew the older sibling character as a boy, and it had her chosen male name. So she has been kind of dealing with this gender thing for over a year now. Personality-wise, she is very creative. She's imaginative. She's a bit of a daydreamer. Sometimes they had to redirect her attention back at school. She tends to kind of get lost in her thoughts. Mom says she doesn't take social cues very well, and in class can be really goofy. She's the class clown. She's very funny. She was sent for an ADHD evaluation based on, I think, the recommendation of the school, but she didn't meet the criteria. But Mom said, we've often wondered if she's on the spectrum or has Asperger's. So she has a lot of sensory issues, and she, as a small kid, was very sensitive to sound, so she was afraid of things like printers, vacuum cleaners, things like that. She is paranoid about letting her arms be exposed to the sun, so she puts on tons of sunscreen and gets kind of fixated on that. And Mom says she always tries to hide her belly button and doesn't like seeing people in two-piece bathing suits or lingerie ads. So she has some quirks about her. Anything else there for personality? I think that's about it. So social and school summary. She was at a private all-girls school, and several of the girls at her school present as boys, including several of the group of small girls in her small friend group when she first came out. Initially, she didn't want to tell teachers or her aunt or her grandparents, who Mom says she's very close to. But since Mom initially wrote me this summary, one of this daughter's close friends has really been pushing her, and she also identifies as trans, and she's been pushing her to kind of come out to teachers and to kind of demand pronouns from Mom and Dad. And since this summary was written, the daughter has come out to her entire class of students, as well as telling her teachers. And parents found out when the teachers, I think, reached out to them, or they discovered that the teachers were using male pronouns for her. Mom says that she has gained a lot of popularity since coming out. So she went from just having one kind of small group of friends, a small handful of girls, to now being kind of in the cool crowd with the popular kids. And so far, parents have had several long discussions with her about the fact that she's unique and that her kind of individuality makes her special, and they're allowing her the typical freedoms of a girl her age, which are, regarding hair and clothing and that sort of thing. And they found a therapist for her that does not work in a gender clinic. And they're moving. So I'm not sure at this point if they've already moved, but Mom in her initial summary said that this coming school year, this fall, she'll be starting at a co-ed public school. So of course that's going to be a different kind of environment. So I wanted to start with some information about the traits that Mom's describing in this summary. So of course, this young girl does not have a diagnosis of autism, though some of the traits Mom's described definitely sound like traits of autism in girls. And the population of autism in girls is distinct from how it presents in boys. And so, of course, this is just my clinical impressions based on just a paper. I've not met this girl. I can't really assess autism anyway, but I'm just going to share some information that Mom can then use to figure out next steps if she does want to get her formally assessed or something like that. Because, the field of assessment is just now catching up with how autism looks in girls, because we've always typically used the criteria that was developed for boys. So there's a lot of new research coming out, and as a field, we've realized that we've probably missed the mark with a lot of girls. So I'm going to link below the video several articles, resources, and pieces of research that I'm referring to as I go through this video. So in a Scientific American article, it basically describes that there are several challenges in diagnosing girls, and it's taken clinicians a long time to figure this out. And one of the people featured in the article is a researcher who studies autism, and he missed his own daughter for several years before she got diagnosed, and he's an expert. So that just goes to show we could easily miss the mark unless we're really, really conscientious of the way things manifest differently in girls and boys. So what we think we know about autism is often not accurate for girls, and a lot of girls get misdiagnosed either as ADD, OCD, or eating disorders and body image issues like anorexia. So this is just like really important for us to keep in mind. If you have a kid who has these traits and body image issues, it's just something to keep in mind that may be linked. So in one study, they looked at 304 girls on the spectrum, and they compared them with autistic boys, with neurotypical boys, and with neurotypical girls, just to kind of see what they would find. And I'm just going to read a direct quote from this article. Each girl's brain, instead, looks like that of a typical boy of the same age, with reduced activity in regions normally associated with socializing. They're still reduced relative to typical developing girls, Pelfrey says, but with the brain activity measures they show would not be considered autistic in a boy. Everything we're looking at brain-wise now seems to be following that pattern, he adds. In short, the brain of a girl with autism may be more like the brain of a typical boy than that of a boy with autism. I just want to pause here because we clinicians and parents and concerned adults who tend to take a more gender critical view of affirmative care for kids who are identifying as trans, we often say, there's no science behind this idea of like, well, you have a boy's brain in a girl's body or vice versa. But what's interesting is there are brain patterns that we know. There's a great deal of overlap. So you can't look at a brain and say for certain if this existed in a male body or a female body. But what you can say is, based on these patterns, I think the statistic is I'm probably 60% right if this is a guy brain, or I'm probably 60% right that this is a woman's brain. So it's so interesting that in this study, the girls who have autism have similar brain patterns to a typical boy. And what that could mean, which is incredibly important if you have a trans-identified girl on the spectrum, is you can actually say, look, some of what you're saying is right. Your brain is kind of similar to a boy's brain, but it's not because your body's wrong. It's because you are different in this way, and this is what makes you unique. And this is really common for girls on the spectrum or girls who have autism to have these traits and to feel maybe really different from other girls. So that's a really interesting excerpt that I found in the article. So there's another small study described in the Scientific American article, and it says, another small study by Jane McGilvray found on a measure of friendship quality and empathy, autistic girls scored as high as typically developing boys of the same age, but lower than typically developing girls. So that's friendship quality and empathy. So in terms of the way girls on the spectrum socially interact, they are going to be more similar to a neurotypical boy. Another kind of overlap there with what we see reported by trans-identified girls on the spectrum. Like they feel like a boy, they act like a boy. Well, in some ways, maybe that's true, but it's not necessarily because they're born in the wrong body. It could be contributed by their autism. So the article also talks about how girls on the spectrum mask their autism, which is very different from how boys present. So I'm just going to read again. Unlike autistic boys, they often report that they don't care about having friends. So any parents here of autistic sons, you might notice that he seems perfectly content just kind of doing his own thing, and he's not out there kind of grappling with these confusing social dynamics to make friends. But girls on the spectrum are much more interested in social connection. So how do they do that? How do they connect socially despite having the same challenges reading social cues and understanding people's emotions? How do they do that? They do that by meticulously following what they perceive as social rules. So they observe and imitate behavior. And I'm going to read you another quote from that article. They're talking about an adult that they were interviewing who is named Jennifer O'Toole. So here's the quote. Jennifer O'Toole, an author and founder of the Asper Kids website and company, was not diagnosed until after her husband, daughter, and sons were all found to be on the spectrum. On the outside, she looks pretty much the opposite of autistic. At Brown University, she was a cheerleader and a sorority girl whose boyfriend was the president of his fraternity. But on the inside, it was different. Social life did not come naturally at all to her. She used her formidable intelligence to become an excellent mimic and actress, and the efforts this took often exhausted her. From the time she started reading at age 3 and throughout her childhood in gifted programs, O'Toole studied people and the way others might study math. And then she copied them, learning what most folks absorb naturally on the playground only through voracious novel reading and the aftermath of embarrassing gaffes. So when we think about this behavior of observation and imitation, and we kind of think about what this family is going through, the fact that she's being so highly influenced by peers, first of all, that's pretty typical in teenagehood, but it might be even more exacerbated by some of these traits she exhibits. And again, I'm not saying that this girl is on the spectrum. What I'm saying is if she exhibits these traits, which perhaps include struggling with social cues and having a hard time making friends, she perhaps is also observing and imitating. So I'm going to continue on from the article. So they're talking about another woman with autism, and it says her name is Frances Pelfrey. Frances Pelfrey's obsession with Disney characters and American Girl dolls might seem typical, not autistic, for example. O'Toole remembers compulsively arranging her Barbies. Furthermore, although autism is often marked by an absence of pretend play, the research finds this is less true for girls. So, pretend play, which is also a pretty common feature of kids who are highly creative and intelligent, is something that the daughter in this summary is inclined to do. So that's an interesting thing to note. Here, too, they can camouflage their symptoms. O'Toole's behavior might have seemed like typical make-believe to her parents because she staged Barbie weddings just like other girls. But rather than imagining she was the bride, O'Toole was actually setting up static visual scenes and not storylines. So an observable behavior like play, when you first take a glance at it, might not really strike you as being different or atypical, but the way the child is playing might actually be very, very different from how other kids are playing. Something I hear a lot from my clients is, I didn't play like the other girls when I was a kid. And that is often used by a trans-identified child as proof that they're not the same. And again, if this kid possibly is on the spectrum, that could be explained by these traits which are really typical for girls on the spectrum. Last quote here from the article. Unlike boys, the difference between typical and autistic development in girls may lie less in the nature of their interests than its level of intensity. These girls may refuse to talk about anything else or take unexpected conversational turns. The words used to describe women on the spectrum come down to the word too, says O'Toole. Too much, too intense, too sensitive, too this, too that. So these are very intense kids, and their interests are intense, and perhaps even their emotional reactions to things may be intense. So these are all things that mom who's watching this video can keep in mind when thinking about, what is contributing to this whole presentation that my daughter's kind of experiencing right now. One person who I know, and I've probably referred several of you to her, is Tania Marshall. She is a clinician in Australia, and she is an expert in how autism presents in girls. And she's been very vocal about rapid onset gender dysphoria and incredibly brave in the way she's kind of called this out. So I'm going to also link to one of the videos that she's made so you can kind of check her out and see what she has to say. The video isn't specifically about rapid onset. She's doing a question and answer actually in this video too. And one of the parents sends in a question about how to kind of navigate the fact that their daughter's on the spectrum and yet they have another child and they don't want that other child to feel left behind. And I thought that was a good video to share with you guys because even though many of you here do not have a child on the spectrum, whenever a family gets absorbed by the ROGD phenomenon, a lot of times everybody's attention is really focused on the one child who's kind of struggling with gender. And so lots of families kind of face that question, like, how do we not neglect our other kids while everybody's kind of focused on this one child who's kind of experiencing a gender issue? So let me kind of now shift over to advice I would give to this family specifically. Again, I think you should check out Tania Marshall because she can give you a lot more details about how to help a child if she's exhibiting these traits. But I guess the first thing would be, seek out an expert who understands how autism presents in girls and go get an evaluation or an assessment. That would be a step that could really change the trajectory of how you approach things. If you don't have a diagnosis at this point and you're just kind of bouncing around this theory between you and your husband, it may be really worthwhile to go have an expert who really has the experience to take a look at your daughter and evaluate her. I also think you should, in the event that happens, and your daughter does end up with a diagnosis, you should try to use the internet to your benefit. So as a disclaimer, I strongly encourage families to be very conscientious about how they let their children use devices. But if you think about your daughter and how she's kind of desperately grasping for an identity and social connection, you may be able to use the internet to steer her towards maybe a healthier conception of herself and a healthier conception of what her traits mean and what they say about her. So like right now, there are so many YouTube channels dedicated to what it's like to be someone on the spectrum. So lots of young women have made fantastic YouTube channels talking about their own experience of being on the spectrum and how that manifests, and they talk about all kinds of things from like self-stimulatory behaviors to social cues and strategies they've used. So you can find a lot of really great YouTube channels right now by people who are on the spectrum who, of course, are going to be possibly another example for your daughter to kind of look to think, oh, like maybe I can identify with that person or that experience. Another thing I think you've probably done, which I think is really wise, is that the move is a great opportunity to reset the way she spends her time. So because she's so young, she's only 13 years old, you can put a lot of distance between her and any peers that you think are influencing her in an unhealthy way. So because she's 13 and not like 18, this doesn't have to be some sort of kind of negotiated thing that she gets to call all the shots. She's a really young teen. So I would start with acknowledging her desire to connect. So you may want to check in with her and ask, if it sometimes feels hard to make friends, like knowing what we know about her and her trouble with social cues and that sort of thing. You might say, sometimes when we really want to connect with people, we might be more likely to just kind of follow the lead of others rather than really trying to understand who we are, doing what feels right for us. Now, granted, she's 13, so the sense of what feels right for her or exactly who she is, that's not really clear yet. But you want to just normalize the fact that when we are really, really drawn to make friends or connect with others, oftentimes we kind of let our own boundaries slip. And this isn't just for kids on the spectrum. We all do this. I mean, I think we can all relate to times when you've really admired somebody or really wanted to connect with someone and you just kind of abandon yourself in a way so that you can be who you think they want you to be or whatever. Like, this is a very relatable experience. So you may want to just kind of sit her down and talk to her about the friendship, and say, like, I see that you really want to connect, but these are things I'm seeing. So in terms of putting distance between her and this one particular friend, so mom basically describes this one girl who identifies as a boy is really pushing her daughter to kind of accelerate the ladder. So I talked with Lisa Marciano about the ladder, like all of these steps you're supposed to do. So first is telling your parents, then it's changing your persona, like your outfits and your hair, and then it's telling teachers, and then, so mom thinks that this girl has really pushed her to kind of accelerate that process. So there are two strategies that mom can use. So first, we talked about just acknowledging the desire to connect and pointing out how that can be tricky. And I would stay very general with that. I wouldn't bring in specifics about that one friend. I would just keep that general. And then you could do one of two things. And to the mom watching, to the family watching, you know your relationship with your child and you know her, and you figure out what's going to go over best. Either A, you can use the move almost as kind of a logistical excuse to fill her time with other things and other people. So, you might like really try to figure out activities where she can meet other kids who maybe have a healthier outlook on life. You might say, in this new place, we're going to put like some more restrictions on the phone, but not just for her, right? I talk about this in one of my newsletters, and I think I talk about this in the boundaries video. How do we as a family just kind of cut down our screen time? This is healthy for everybody. After school hangouts, if she's begging to hang out with this other friend, due to the move, you can maybe make some kind of an excuse like, we don't have time, or we have to go to the store, or you can find kind of reasons that the hanging out isn't going to happen, without specifically saying you're not allowed to see this person. That's one strategy. It really depends on your child, your relationship with your child, and what you think will happen. The other option is to have a really explicit conversation about why you want her to spend her energy connecting with other friends. And this kind of tacks on to what I said at the beginning, like acknowledging that when you want to connect, it can be tricky. And so you might kind of call out what you're seeing. And a framing that you might use is you might say something like, I noticed that this friendship, I know it means a lot to you, and I know you think so-and-so is really helping you. But what I see is that she or he, however you say it, your friend isn't really letting you be yourself. And you might say, I remember about last year, you didn't want us to tell grandma and grandpa, you didn't want to tell your aunt, you didn't want to tell your teachers, and I noticed your friend, she kind of pushed you a lot to tell those people. And to me, it seems like she wasn't really letting you be yourself. She was trying to kind of make you do stuff or push you maybe too hard. So something like that could be useful. And just pointing out that your friend is kind of taking over how you do things. And even though that's one way to make a friendship, There are better ways to make a friendship where you still get to be yourself and you get to be your own person, and your friend respects that, and you like the unique things about your friend, and your friend likes the unique things about you, and everyone respects each other's timing and things like that. So, I mean, if she has these traits of being on the spectrum, she needs someone to literally spell out for her, what are these rules of friendship? What are the rules of social engagement? Because she might be just kind of grabbing whatever she sees and not having kind of a very concrete understanding of like whether this is appropriate or not. I've worked in school systems and I've worked with kids on the spectrum for a long time, and what I see is they often get taken advantage of. Other kids will start to realize that they're gullible, and they'll like dare them to do weird things, or they'll get them to, I don't know, just kids can really take advantage. And I'm not saying that her friend is deliberately taking advantage as to mock her or something like that. But if you have one kid with a little bit of a domineering personality and you have another kid who's just gung-ho to try anything and everything, you've got a dynamic there that can get locked in and can be very unhealthy. So those are two strategies, either just filling her time up with other stuff or having a really explicit conversation with her about the dynamics that you see. Again, if she does have these traits, I think it will be really important for parents to get in that habit of like spelling things out in a really concrete way. And that's going to take me to my next point. But regarding this friendship, if you think your daughter's very attached and sensitive, and if you try to explicitly say like, I don't know if this friendship is healthy, is that going to blow up and become a big issue? I don't know. Like, as a 13-year-old, I think it's totally fine for parents to say, I don't think it's healthy to spend time with this person, and here's why. And then you set the boundary, and yes, she'll probably be upset for a while, but if she's creative and funny and like likes to get along with other kids, she'll find other friends and she'll survive. So I guess that would be something for you to gauge. Okay, so I'm going to move on to discussing a little bit more about concrete explanations. So in general, girls who are on the spectrum are really vulnerable to, let's say, unhealthy thinking patterns for a couple of reasons. So first of all, they have a strained relationship with their body because of their sensory issues. So your daughter, if she does have like sound sensitivities and that sort of thing, imagine all of her sensory inputs are heightened. So that is going to create a slightly different relationship with her body than she might have if she didn't have those traits. Kids on the spectrum have very black and white thinking. So that means stereotyped behavior regarding gender, let's say, can be taken to literally mean you're a boy. And that's, of course, reinforced by trans ideology. So even kids who aren't on the spectrum are being kind of fed that bad idea. And if you already have a tendency to think in very rigid social rule kind of things, if you hear, oh, well, if you like this or that thing, then that means you're a boy. Oh, that's a social rule. I'm going to hang on to that, and I'm going to get really rigid about it and obsessive about it. That makes you very vulnerable. And lastly, if she has a penchant for fantasy and creativity, that's wonderful. That's a great strength of hers. But it also means that the kind of other side of that coin is that she might be very susceptible to this kind of fantastical thinking that is part of this current, it's a very juvenile understanding of gender, right? Like if you just say you're a boy, you literally are. I mean, it's very magical. So she's got these vulnerabilities if she is exhibiting these spectrum traits, okay? So being very straightforward with her and explaining that she's come across a lot of untrue information. And in this case, you would really have to speak in a loving, calm, but confident manner, basically just to explain to her that some of the ideas that she's sharing, they're not true. in a lot of my videos, I talk about taking a very neutral stance and just trying to get more information. And that's maybe your first step. Like, I'm not sure, you'd have to gauge it. But in the case where she's kind of latched onto things that just don't make sense, it could be very useful to just explain to her. She's very young. I mean, 13 is very young. So you might, for example, show her like really basic biological information about the body and what does it mean to be male or female. And in the context of that discussion, you really want to reinforce that both boys and girls have a broad range of personality traits. And sometimes if we have personality traits that we don't recognize in other girls, that can make us feel really different. But that is the real information that you need to somehow expose her to in a way that is loving and confident and not a blow-up fight and not like drilling her and telling her she's wrong and crazy. Like, you just want to give her information and maybe even explicitly say, some of the information that I see out there online, it's actually not true. And I'll show you some examples or I'll explain why. And one of the things you could do is show her examples of girls who are gender nonconforming that maybe on paper would totally fit the criteria for gender dysphoria or for being trans, quote unquote, and say, you know, look at this, let's look at this together. Oftentimes what I do is I kind of scour the internet for examples of posts where older women, like people from my generation or older, are talking about, you know, if I was a kid, I would have been trans. Like, here's what I was like as a kid. And there are a lot of great examples of kind of comment threads like that. This is another way you could use the internet to your advantage, right? But people that she might know, Billie Eilish, she's a singer who's like really popular right now. And even though she's not trying obviously to trick people into thinking she's a boy, she's got a lot of traits about her that don't fit into this cookie cutter, super feminine Barbie persona that is unfortunately held up in trans ideology as like, this is what a girl looks like. Well, no, that's just not true. Lots of girls look all kinds of different ways. So Billie Eilish is a great example. And also, I mean, I love using literature when you have a kid who's creative, who likes to read, who likes stories. I'm going to link below the video an article that talks about tomboys in literature. And a lot of them are old because unfortunately in 2019, if you're going to write a story about a tomboy, she's probably going to be trans, which is, there's not a lot of like gender nonconforming females anymore in characters and stories. But Nancy Drew is a great example. I used to read Nancy Drew, and she had really tomboyish traits in some ways and some girly traits in other ways, which is nice because she wasn't having to discard the entire kind of spectrum of femininity in order to embrace some of her tomboyish traits. And it wasn't an identity or a political statement that she throws in your face. Nancy Drew is just herself, and she subtly just exhibits the fact that as a female, you can have a broad range of traits and personality traits. What else? Yeah, I mean, I guess to think about it this way, if she is developing her identity through imitation, right now, in 2019, she doesn't have a lot of examples of non-conforming girls that she might be able to imitate. That's why I think if she's able to get a diagnosis, showing her cool Aspie girls on YouTube who maybe remind you of her, you might want to kind of scout first to see what comes up. Showing her examples of people who talk about their own childhood and what they were like as kids, and that they're actually happy as women. They have quirky, interesting personalities. And showing her characters, whether it's pop stars or people in novels, that she might be able to kind of connect with and relate to. So those are ways that you can give her another image that she might latch onto or might imitate that is a healthier self-conception. So I'm going to link all of the kind of things that I discussed below. I'm also going to include a really great thread of women talking about how they were really gender nonconforming as kids. There's also an article about butch lesbian identity, which is really useful, though I don't think necessarily your daughter is butch, but those women talk about how they in childhood very much pretended to be boys and wished they were boys and had very masculine traits. And as they became adults and met other women who were similar, they started to embrace their bodies and their masculinity in a female body. So those are great examples of ways that having someone else to relate to can kind of dissipate some of this desire to be a different person or have a different body. I hope that is useful, and I will see you guys in the next Q&A. Thanks.